Okay, so what I'm sort of hoping to do is to give a really kind of ground level um, presentation on some things that you might want to know about teaching ethics if you don't have expertise in ethics. Later in the workshop, I think we'll talk about maybe some more advanced issues, but this is supposed to be a kind of like just sort of getting you comfortable with the idea of teaching ethics in a technical course if you really have very little background in teaching ethics. Um, and to reiterate a couple of the things that Ellen has said, why bother to do this at all? Well, I mean, Georgia Tech and as far as I know, the USG system generally does require all students to take a designated ethics course, but as Ellen mentioned, we don't think that one standalone ethics course by itself is enough for a few reasons. One is it just sends a really bad message to students, kind of isolating an ethics course off to the side, and failing to talk about ethics in any other course really sends the message to students that, well, ethics just isn't that important. It's certainly far less important than the technical skills that they will learn in their other courses. And it really sends to them the message that this is something that this is sort of a hurdle that they need to jump over, but once they jump over it, then they can forget it. And that's certainly not a message that we want to be sending to our students. And in addition to that, it just fails to train students who will, in many cases, become professionals who will have to make complex and ethically significant decisions throughout their careers. We're not training the students in the ways that we will need to train them, or that they need to be trained simply by offering one standalone ethics course, and that's it. So we're advocating a kind of both and approach where we continue to offer standalone ethics courses that are taught by faculty who have a lot of expertise in ethics, plus embedding ethics throughout the curriculum, including in technical courses. And by embedding ethics throughout the curriculum, I mean, we mean sort of talking about ethical issues in non-ethics courses, but that can be done in a variety of ways and to a variety of degrees. Um, so what do you need to know in order to do this? Well, one thing that it's helpful to know is it's not just about knowledge of ethics. Sensitivity and awareness are crucial, and instructors can serve as good role models for students simply by identifying ethical issues. So for those of you who have, say, virtually zero knowledge of ethical theory and would feel pretty uncomfortable, say, trying to lead a high level discussion about ethical issues, I think it can be really beneficial simply to identify ethical issues when you see them, right? So if you're working with a data set that represents human beings in terms of binary gender identities, right? Or other things that you think there's an ethical issue there, there's potentially an ethical issue there. We're not going to take the time to discuss it in detail because there are a lot of other things that we need to do. But simply sort of identifying or flagging this as an ethical issue for students, I think, can be important. Among other things, that's you know, that's communicating to students that ethics is not something that that should only be talked about in one standalone course, but simply, I mean, when students see instructors in technical courses simply identifying or flagging issues as important ethical issues, I think that can be important for them. But just because it's not all about the knowledge doesn't mean that some knowledge isn't helpful. It is. But I think a little bit can go a long way. So in the rest of this presentation, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions, I'd like to provide a little bit of background. I'll start off by talking about a couple of what I take to be misconceptions about ethics. and then very, very briefly say a little bit about some ethical principles that can be helpful in discussing ethics. So one, I'll talk about two misconceptions right now. One misconception that I see a lot among both students and among some faculty is that ethics is just about compliance, nothing else, and that compliance issues are sort of trivial and uninteresting. There's a lot that's wrong with this. I think one is that, well, there are a lot of compliance issues that are far from trivial and that are pretty interesting. But it's also the case that ethics isn't just about compliance. Ethics is about how we treat one another or how we impact one another. And these are issues that are really important and really interesting. So whenever we're talking about using a technology that impacts other human beings or other people or other individuals, whenever we talk about, say, a design decision about a particular piece of software and looking at how making this design decision in one way will impact people versus how it would impact people in another if we make it in another way. Those are ethical issues, and in my experience, these are ethical issues that students are really interested in and really enjoy talking about. And so when we get past the idea that ethics is just about compliance, we sort of open up a whole world of interesting issues and issues that students find really interesting to talk about. The second misconception is one that I always have to kind of overcome when I'm talking about ethics with my students, which is that ethics is purely subjective. It's all just about how you feel, and it's not at all amenable to rational evaluation. So this idea that, well, you know, something might be true for you, but it's not true for me, and that's all there is to say about it. That this is a misconception. There are ethical principles or norms that are widely accepted as many scientific norms, I would suggest, and that do serve as a shared basis for rational evaluation. And I think you can communicate this pretty quickly to students, but ethics is something that you can actually talk about rationally, that you can have rational discussions about. So what are some of these shared ethical principles? There are a lot of places that you could go to find a sort of very quick introduction to widely shared ethical principles. The Mozilla stuff is one place you could go that just came out, and so I didn't use that as an example. But one place that I go to introduce my students, to give my students a very kind of brief introduction to ethics, is the sort of classic Belmont report, which articulates ethical principles that should be adhered to in human subjects research. This might be, I mean, if you're interested in a very kind of quick introduction to ethics, this might be a nice place for you to go, particularly given that, you know, probably many of you have experience with IRBs. It might seem ironic that I'm suggesting this, given that I just said that ethics isn't just about compliance, and you might think about IRBs in terms of compliance. But the Belmont report, I think, does a nice job of providing some of the kind of theoretical background to the principles that we take to govern IRB research. But anyway, so what are some of these ethical principles? Well, the three ethical principles that they identify are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. These do not constitute a kind of algorithmic decision procedure. These aren't principles that allow us to determine unambiguously in a kind of recipe-like fashion what the right thing to do is, but they do serve as norms that provide rational constraints on ethical decision-making. So very often they will rule out certain things as being clearly ethically problematic, but in some cases there can be judgment required in how one applies these principles. So let me say just a little bit more about each of these principles. The principle of respect for persons is really a principle that emphasizes individual freedom of choice and the rights of individuals to make informed decisions for themselves. This is a principle that is widely shared amongst, well, most all of us. We all take it to be important that that we should be able to make informed decisions for ourselves. Notions of informed consent come in here, that it's important that um, uh, when we impact other people, that they consent to those impacts, and that they do so voluntarily with the information that they need to make rational decisions for themselves. This is one ethical principle that is, I think, again, widely shared and really important. The second is beneficence, which is just the idea that we should promote the general welfare and, to the extent possible, reduce risk of harm. Right? And here, risk-benefit analysis plays an important role in determining, what counts as what satisfies this principle. But so far, we have two, again, very widely shared principles. It's good to promote benefits and reduce harms, and it's good to allow for freedom of choice. And then the third is the principle of justice, which concerns the distribution of rights, benefits, and burdens. We can all acknowledge that it's important that individuals be able to decide things for themselves. We can all acknowledge that that it's good to promote benefits and try to reduce harms. Things become complicated when we realize that there are very few technologies that say promote benefits for everyone. There are very few technologies that say promote individual choice for everyone. Typically, complex technologies or complex decisions impact different groups in different ways. And that's where this principle becomes relevant. As I said, while these principles do not serve as a kind of algorithmic decision procedure that tells us what to do in every particular case, they do, in many situations, rule out certain decisions or actions as being clearly ethically unacceptable. The Tuskegee syphilis trial is one that's discussed in the Belmont report as an example of that. But again, there can be decisions that do require nuanced judgments, and where it becomes clear that these principles can be sort of interpreted in different ways and need to be weighed against one another. So the recent decision by the Facebook Oversight Board really requires decision makers to say, weigh the benefits of inhibiting certain kinds of incendiary speech versus impacts for freedom of speech and other things. This last slide that I have here is just a couple of kind of schematic discussion questions that I've written out for those of you who might, again, not have much of a background with ethics and might be a little bit nervous about, say, leading a discussion about an ethical question. A kind of basic knowledge of the three ethical principles that I've just introduced, I think allows one to do a pretty good job of leading a discussion on an issue, even if you're not an expert about it. So questions like, how does a particular design decision or data set choice, etc., impact people's capabilities of making informed decisions for themselves? What are some of the different decision-making capabilities impacted? Are there some capabilities that are advanced and others compromised? How might one weigh the importance of these different capabilities? You might not have all of the answers to these questions, but even without having all of the answers to these questions, one can lead an intelligent discussion about them. What are the benefits of said, say, design decision or data set choice, and what are the possible harms? And then what are the different types of benefits and harms that we might consider? Physical, social, psychological, political. How might one weigh the importance of these different types, right? And then finally, how are different populations differentially impacted by said decision or choice? Bringing in questions about justice. You can use these questions in order to kind of highlight some of the principles that I've just discussed, and in order to provide a kind of framework for students to be able to think about and articulate ethical issues without necessarily coming to a final answer about, say, what's the right thing to do here. That can go a long way in helping students to think about some of these issues clearly.